My name is Rebecca Holt, and I was 30 for the year my own family taught me exactly what they believed a life was worth. I was standing in a cemetery, my shoes sinking into wet earth, to fresh graves laid out in front of me, when my phone started buzzing inside my coat pocket. My husband, Mark, was in one of those graves. My daughter, Sophie, was 7. She was in the other. My parents and my sister had skipped the burial completely. They called it a trivial event not worth attending, then flew off to Cancun with my sister's family the very next morning. 5 days after I buried my entire world, my mother called, not to grieve with me, but to ask me for money. And what she said on that call is the reason I will never call her mom again. These days, I wake up at 4:30 in the morning. My house is still dark when I walk out to the driveway. And I don't bother turning on the kitchen light anymore because there's no one left inside to see it shine. The first thing my hands touch every single day is the cold steel of my truck keys. They warm up by the time I get to the lot, and the cab always smells like diesel and old coffee. For about 15 minutes before sunrise, that smell is the only thing in my life that still feels like mine. I drove long-haul freight for 9 years before any of this happened. Truck stop attendants used to assume my husband owned the rig, and I let them believe it because correcting people felt exhausting. Mark thought that was hilarious. He'd order his pancakes and just watch some dispatcher hand the clipboard to him, waiting for the moment they realized the actual boss was the woman sitting beside him with grease stains on her knuckles. I still keep his travel mug in my cab. I don't drink out of it. I just like knowing it's there, riding along like he used to. People assume grief is loud. Mostly, it's just a string of small moments where you reach out for someone and your hand closes around nothing. By our back door, there's still a pair of small pink sneakers, lined up exactly where Sophie left them. I tell myself I'll move them eventually. Then another morning comes, and I don single quotes T.11 months ago. I still had a family waiting for me at home. But before I tell you how I lost them, I need to tell you how the people who share my blood decided. They had somewhere better to be. It had been raining for 3 straight days that spring, the kind of storm that turns a quiet creek into a wall of moving water in under half an hour. I was 400 miles away on a delivery run, hauling refrigerated goods. When my phone lit up at a gas station outside Tulsa, Mark had picked Sophie up early from her grandmother's house because of the weather warnings. He was careful behind the wheel, 18 years of driving without a single ticket. The kind of man who slowed down at yellow lights even when someone behind him leaned on the horn. He took the back road home because the highway was already flooding. There's a low water crossing a few miles outside town, a small dip where a creek runs beneath the road. On an ordinary day, you wouldn't think twice about it. That day, the water rose over the crossing while they were still on it. They found his truck a quarter-mile downstream, caught against a stand of trees. I won't describe what came after that. Some things aren't meant to be told, and Sophie was 7. She deserves to be more than a sad detail in somebody's story. What I will tell you is that I drove home in 8 hours straight. No sleep, hands shaking the entire way, running through every if only my mind could produce. I got back to a town that already knew before I did, casseroles lined up on my porch, a sheriff's car parked in my driveway. I had driven 8 hours as fast as I could, and I was still 8 hours too late. The first call I made, before I could even get the words out, was to my mother. Out of everyone on earth, I believed she would come. Her first question was whether the funeral could wait 2 weeks. I remember sitting on my kitchen floor with the phone against my ear, certain I had misheard her. She and my father had a trip already planned, Cancun, 6 days, with my sister Vanessa, her husband Derek, and their kids. It had been booked since the fall. The deposits were non-refundable. I told her my husband and daughter were dead. She responded in the tone you'd use with a coworker who'd missed a deadline. Then Vanessa took over the family group chat, because Vanessa always takes over. She wrote that of course everyone felt terrible, but the trip was already paid for. And the kids had been looking forward to it for months. And surely I wouldn't want them to cancel the whole vacation over what she actually typed, word for word. For everyone to read, a trivial event not worth attending. I read that sentence 4 times. A trivial event. My daughter's funeral. My mother's reply came 2 minutes later, a thumbs up emoji and the word agreed. Not one of them asked how Sophie died. Not one of them asked for Mark's middle name for the headstone, or whether I was eating, or whether I was alone in that house with a pair of tiny pink sneakers by the door. They asked which week worked better for their schedule. I stopped asking anything back. I told them the burial would happen on Saturday, with or without them. Then I hung up and never called again. That was the moment I finally understood something cold and clear about the people who raised me. They had never once, in 34 years, chosen me first. And strangely, knowing that didn't break me, it freed my hands for what came next. At Mark and Sophie's service, the front pew reserved for family sat completely empty. I chose to sit in the second row instead, because the people in the second row had actually shown up. My Uncle Frank drove 5 hours from out of state and stood beside me the entire service, his hand on my shoulder like a man holding up a fence post in a storm. The church filled with Mark's co-workers in their uniform shirts, the regulars from the diner where we used to eat, Sophie's first-grade teacher, who cried harder than I did, and her entire youth soccer team in their little maroon jerseys, because Mark had coached them every Saturday. My parents were on a beach. My sister was on a beach. Their seats stayed empty while 100 working people packed in shoulder to say goodbye to a truck driver and a little girl. I gave the eulogy myself. I didn't trust my voice in anyone else's hands. I said Mark slowed down for yellow lights. I said Sophie drew trucks instead of princesses. I said they were the best things I ever built and the only things I couldn't keep. I never mentioned the empty pew. I didn't need to. Everyone in that room could see it. Afterward, my uncle walked me to my car and said the only honest thing anyone in my family said that entire month. Rebecca, they're not coming back to you. Not really. You need to start living like that's the truth. I buried my husband and daughter surrounded by the people who actually showed up. And as I stood at those two fresh graves, my phone buzzed again in my coat, my mother's name, calling from a number with a Mexico area code. I let it ring out into the wet grass, with no idea yet what she was about to ask of me. 5 days later, I finally answered, mostly out of sheer exhaustion. There was no "how are you?" no "I'm sorry I missed it." Just airport noise in the background and my mother's voice going straight to business, like she was calling about an overdue invoice. Rebecca, we need to talk about the money. I sat down. I asked what money. She said the $40,000 in a tone that implied I should already know exactly what she meant. Then she explained that Derek's auto shop was in serious financial trouble, that the family needed to come together, that I needed to see the bigger picture. When I didn't respond fast enough, she said the sentence I will hear in my sleep for the rest of my life. We can always make more money, Rebecca. We can't make more family. She said that to me, the daughter whose family was in the ground because they wouldn't get on a plane home. She said it from an airport, with sand probably still in her sandals, asking me for $40,000 to bail out the brother-in-law who'd been lying on a beach while my little girl was lowered into the earth. I held the phone away from my face and looked at those small pink sneakers by the door. I thought about how someone could take the most beautiful word in the English language, family, and use it like a crowbar to pry money out of a person they had just abandoned. I came very close to laughing, and very close to something much worse. Instead, I asked one quiet question. What $40,000 do you think is yours? There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that tells you someone has already decided what they're owed and just hasn't said it out loud yet. In that pause, I started to understand exactly what they believed they were entitled to and exactly how wrong they were. Here's the real story behind that $40,000. 3 years earlier, before any of this happened, I wanted to stop hauling other people's freight and buy my own truck. A reliable used tractor cost around $85,000. I'd saved most of it myself the hard way, but Mark and I needed a bank loan to close the gap. The lender looked at my down payment and asked where $40,000 of it had come from, because that's standard procedure. That money had come from my parents 2 years before that, handed to me in front of my sister at a holiday gathering when they were feeling generous. They called it a gift toward our future. I hadn't thought twice about it at the time. One part of a down payment comes from relatives. Lenders require those relatives to sign a gift letter, a real legal document stating the money is a true gift, that no repayment is expected, and that it was never a loan. I drove the paperwork to my parents' house myself, sat at their kitchen table, and watched both of them sign it so I could finance my truck. Then I filed it away and forgot it existed. The way you forget something you'll never need again. Until the day you need it more than anything you owned. My mother had clearly forgotten it too, or decided it no longer counted. 3 years later, with Derek's shop sinking and my entire life buried in a cemetery, she'd quietly reclassified that gift in her head. It wasn't a gift anymore. It was an investment, one she now believed the family could demand back whenever it suited them. She had no idea that letter was sitting in my filing cabinet at home. Derek called the next day to finish what my mother had started. My sister's husband had opened an auto repair shop 2 years earlier with money he didn't really have. And now the loans were crushing him and the shop was barely staying open. He didn't mention Sophie either. He led with the shop, then with family, then with the line that told me everything I needed to know. Look, Rebecca, you're alone now. What do you even need it for? I let that sentence sit in the air. You're alone now. As if my husband and daughter were a line item they'd helpfully crossed off my budget. As if grief came with a refund. Then Vanessa texted, because Vanessa cannot let silence exist. She wrote that family money was a shared pool, that I'd drawn from it once and it was someone else's turn now, and that frankly my attitude was hurting everyone. A shared pool. I'd repaid my parents' generosity 100 different ways over the years, but you can't repay people who keep moving the goalposts. The worst part wasn't even the asking. It was learning, a week later, from a cousin, that they'd already been telling the extended family their version of events, that poor Derek was struggling and selfish Rebecca, sitting on her trucks, wouldn't lift a finger to help her own family. They'd built the entire story before I'd even said no. They just needed me to play the villain in it. I decided right then I wasn't going to argue with their story. I was going to outlast it. I won't pretend I never wavered. There's a thing I do, a thing a lot of people do, where I'd rather carry the whole weight myself than make a scene. I've been the one everyone leaned on since I was 10 years old, packing my sister's lunches because our mother was tired. So one night, about a week into the calls, I actually sat down with my checkbook. $40,000 would wipe out my savings, but it would make the phone stop ringing. And some exhausted part of me just wanted the noise to end. My Uncle Frank caught me at it. He'd started dropping by, fixing things that didn't need fixing, sitting in Mark's old recliner so it wouldn't feel so empty. He saw the checkbook open on the table and didn't yell. He just said, "You'd really write that check, wouldn't you? You'd pay them to keep skipping your funerals." I put the pen down because he was right. I wasn't afraid of being called and grateful. I was just so used to being the one who fixes things that I'd almost fixed the wrong problem. The next morning at 4:30, I did the one thing that has never let me down. I went back to work. Facing every man who assumed I'd fold without Mark wasn't easy. The loan officer who held my line of credit asked, in a voice that was somehow worse than rudeness, whether I'd considered selling my equipment while it still held value. A freight broker I'd worked with for years suddenly had concerns about whether I could keep the business running. I heard secondhand that a couple of them were already telling shippers I wouldn't last the season. A grieving widow with 2 trucks, they'd already written me off. Then Patricia found me. Patricia is pushing 60, ran dispatch for a regional carrier for nearly 3 decades, and knows more about freight than those brokers will ever learn. She took me out for breakfast and gave me the only business advice that actually mattered. Honey, from here on out, people are either working with you or working against you. There's no third option. Stop waiting for the doubters to come around. Make them irrelevant. So I did exactly that. I called every shipper who'd ever trusted Mark and told them the plain truth. The owner was the woman with grease under her nails, same as always, and she was still on time. I undercut nobody and outworked everybody. About 3 weeks later, a contract landed on my desk that was too big for two trucks, a regional grocery chain. Steady freight, the kind of account that builds a real company. All I had to do was be brave enough to take it to handle that contract. I needed a second tractor on the road fast, so I started cleaning out Mark's old truck to sell it. That truck had been his pride, spotless, maintenance logs up to date. A little plastic dinosaur Sophie had glued to the dashboard, so Daddy has a friend. I sat in that cab for an hour before I could touch anything. Then I started going through his things gently, the way you'd search a sleeping person's pockets. His sunglasses, an old church bulletin, a roll of quarters for the air pump. Down in the door pocket, under a folded map, I found his logbook. Not the digital kind required now, but the old paper kind he kept anyway out of habit. 18 years of his life, written in pencil. Every trip, every mile in his careful block letters. I held it for a long time before I could open it. It felt like opening his hands. I told myself I'd read it later, when I was stronger, and set it on the passenger seat next to his coffee mug. But I'd already noticed something on the last page. It wasn't a log trip. It was writing, more of it than a typical entry, filling the lines. It took me 3 more days to finally open that last page. While the logbook sat untouched on my kitchen table, my family went to work on my reputation. Vanessa ran the campaign because Vanessa treats family like a marketing account. The texts came daily, reminders of everything our parents had supposedly done for me. Guilt dressed up as concern, a photo of Derek's kids captioned with a line about possibly losing their house. As if their house and my dead daughter belonged on the same scale. My cousin Renee called and told me what was circulating, that I'd come into money and turn my back on the family. That grief had made me cruel. That my parents were heartbroken by my coldness. The same parents who'd been snorkeling while I picked out a child-sized casket. They had flipped the entire narrative. In their version, they were the wounded ones. And I was the villain who refused to help her struggling brother law. For about a day. It made me sick. Because a lie repeated by enough people starts to feel like weather, something you just have to live under. Then it made me clear-headed instead. They weren't going to stop on their own. People who rewrite the story to make themselves the victims never volunteer to put the pen down. Renee, to her credit, wasn't buying any of it. I was at that funeral, Becky, she told me. I saw the empty pew. I'm not crazy. That was the first crack. One person in that family who'd looked at the same room I had and seen the truth in it. Renee called again on a Thursday. And her voice was different, lower, the kind people use when telling you something they're not supposed to. They're planning something, she said. My parents' 40th wedding anniversary was coming up, a big party at a rented hall. The whole extended family invited. I hadn't planned on going, but Renee had overheard my mother and Vanessa mapping it out at my aunt's kitchen table. My father planned to stand up during the toasts and make a public appeal, framing me as the daughter who refused to help her family in their hour of need. They figured I'd either cave under 40 relatives watching or refuse and prove I was exactly the cold woman they'd been describing. Either way, they thought they'd win. That night, I finally opened the last page of Mark's logbook. It wasn't a love letter. Mark wasn't that kind of man. It was a list titled the way he titled everything. Plain and direct. Things we're going to do. Buy our own rig. Paid off. No bank. Get our name on the door. Not someone else's. And then the line that took the floor out from under me. Carter and daughter. So Sophie grows up knowing her mom built something. He'd already named the company we always talked about starting. Carter and daughter, for the little girl who drew trucks instead of princesses. So she'd grow up watching her mother run something with her own name on it. I sat with that for a long time. Then I reached up to the visor of his cab, where I knew Sophie kept her artwork, and unclipped the drawing that had been riding there for 2 years, 3 lumpy crane trucks in a row. A stick figure with brown pigtails standing beside them, and underneath, in careful first-grade handwriting, Mommy's trucks. They'd called her funeral a trivial event. They'd called my entire life a budget line. And I was about to make that little girl's name worth more than their entire vacation. The next week, I filed the paperwork. The business stopped being Rebecca Holt owner-operator and became Carter and Daughter Freight. I kept and Daughter even though she was gone because some names you earn by loving someone, not by keeping them around. I decided to go to the anniversary party, not to fight, but to put the truth on the table in front of every witness they'd gathered, where they couldn't text it away or spin it on a phone call. But truth alone had never been enough with my family. They'd been bending it my whole life. I needed something with their own signatures on it. I remembered the gift letter, filed away with my loan documents. I wasn't sure my copy was still legible, but I knew the original lived in my bank's file. If I was going to lay that page down in front of 40 people, it needed to be official and undeniable. So I called my bank and asked how a borrower requests a certified copy of a document from her own closed loan file. A few days, a small fee. That was the entire cost of the thing that was about to change everyone's expression in that room. The loan officer found the original without much trouble, both signatures, right above the standard language banks use to remove all doubt. The funds represent a gift. No repayment is expected. This is not a loan in any form. I had him certify and stamp a copy, and I drove it home flat on the passenger seat like it might blow away. The church hall smelled like coffee and carnations. They'd done it up nicely, a long table with a white cloth, a cake printed with my parents' wedding photo, a gold banner reading 40 years. About 40 relatives had gathered. 40 years, $40,000, 40 witnesses. My mother's face did something complicated when she saw me walk in surprise and triumph at once, because she hadn't been sure I'd actually show up. And now that I had, she assumed I'd walked straight into her trap. They got through the toast. Then my father stood, tapped his glass, and the room quieted for him. He thanked everyone for coming, talked about family and sticking together through hard times. Then he turned to me. Some of us, he said, have been blessed and forgotten where the blessing came from. We helped Rebecca when she had nothing, $40,000, and now that she's doing well, she won't lift a finger for her own family. Vanessa added, sweet as poison. It's a shame we even missed that funeral for family. And this is the thanks we get. A trivial event. She'd said it again, out loud, in front of everyone. I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. That's the part I want you to understand, because it mattered more than anything else that night. 40 people were braced for a scene, and I gave them quiet instead. Quiet in a loud room is the loudest thing there is. Dad, I said, you're right that you gave me $40,000. Let's talk about that. But first, let's talk about the funeral. Since Vanessa brought it up, I reached into my coat, pulled out a printed timeline, and laid it flat on the white tablecloth. This is the day my husband and daughter were buried, I said, pointing. And this, I moved my finger, is the date on the beach photo Mom posted online. 1 day later. Making memories, the caption said, I lucked up. You didn't miss a funeral for family. You skipped a child's funeral for a vacation, and then you came home and asked the grieving mother for $40,000. The room went still. My father's mouth opened and shut without a sound. My mother's certainty drained out of her face in real time. Then Derek shot up out of his chair, red-faced, shouting that I was twisting things, that the shop was failing, that I owed this family, that I was selfish and bitter and alone. I let him finish completely. When he ran out of breath, I reached into my coat one more time and laid the certified gift letter beside the timeline, sliding it toward my father. You both signed this, I said, 3 years ago, at your own kitchen table. It's the gift letter the bank required. It says, in your own signatures, that the $40,000 was a gift. No repayment expected. Not a loan in any form. I let that settle. So a demand to pay it back as a debt doesn't really hold up. Then I said the only things I'd come there to say. To Vanessa, you taught me which events are worth attending. I'll remember that for the rest of my life. To my mother, you told me we can't make more family. You were right, so I stopped trying to make one out of you. To Derek, you asked what I even needed the money for. I needed it to bury my daughter. You needed Kanken. Nobody spoke. Then a chair scraped at the back of the hall, and Renee stood up. I was at that funeral, she said clearly. Everything she just said is true. I have the dates. After that, the room turned the way a loaded truck turns slow. And then, all at once, an aunt I barely knew reached over and quietly slid the gift letter so more people could read it. People who'd come ready to judge the cold and grateful daughter were now staring at a timeline, 2 signatures, and a beach photo, doing the only honest thing left, looking ashamed of what they'd believed. My mother said my name once, like a question, like she still believed there was a version of this where I sat back down and ate cake. There wasn't. Derek finally stopped shouting and just stood there. And for 1 second, I saw the real thing underneath all that entitlement, pure fear. He was going to lose the shop, maybe the house, and his kids would feel it. He'd gambled the whole family on bullying me into covering it. And now the family was looking at him instead. "Becky," he said quietly, "I'm scared." And I believed him. It was the closest thing to honest anyone in that room had offered me in 11 months. But he still hadn't said Sophie's name. Not once. So I folded my 2 pages back into my coat and said the truest thing I had left. "I hope you figure it out, Derek. I really do. But you're going to have to do it without me." Then I walked out into the parking lot, and the air felt clean and cold. And I could finally breathe. I went no contact with my parents and my sister after that. No dramatic letter, no blow up. I just stopped answering, and eventually they stopped calling. The quiet that followed was the most peaceful thing I'd felt in years. I capped the people who actually showed up. Frank comes for Sunday dinner and sits in Mark's old recliner. And I've made peace with that, because somebody good should sit there. Renee and I talk every week. Carter and Daughter Freight runs 5 trucks now. Every one of them painted deep green. Every one with 3 lumpy crane trucks traced small on the door. Right where you'd only notice if you looked. I moved Sophie's little pink sneakers, finally, not far. Just to a shelf where I can still see them on my way out the door at 4:30. Family, I've learned, isn't the people who share your blood. It's the people who show up when there's nothing left to gain, and the ones who disappear the second there is. That's my story. A funeral they called trivial, a vacation they couldn't cancel, and 1 page they signed and forgot. If someone in your life keeps asking you to carry them while they skip your hardest days, let this be your sign to set the page down. You never owed a debt you didn't sign for. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Tell me in the comments who actually showed up for you, and hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.